The pencil marks are still on the doorframe. Mia, 4'1", spring of 2011. Leo, 3'9", the summer after. There's a smudged one below them that nobody can date anymore, back when the kids used to fight over who got measured first. Daniel runs his thumb across the wood the way he always does when the phone rings, and he doesn't recognize the number. It's a realtor. Young voice, friendly, new to the area. She's calling because she noticed his house has been in the family a long time, and she wonders if he's ever thought about what it might be worth in today's market. Daniel says he hasn't, which isn't quite true. She gives him a number anyway, the way they do. $345,000, maybe more with the right updates. He thanks her and hangs up and stands in the hallway for a second longer than he needs to. He bought this house for $152,000. He was 27. He didn't invent anything, didn't inherit anything, didn't time a market or flip a property or find some secret. He just never left. Same mailbox for 20 years, same third stair that creaks. Same front door, repainted twice, never replaced. Everyone he knew moved. Once, twice, 3 times, each move a little bigger, a little further out, a little closer to the version of success that shows up in a driveway. Daniel stayed still, and somehow, staying still turned out to be the loudest financial decision he ever made. To understand why, you have to go back to the beginning, when staying still didn't feel like a decision at all. It felt like the only thing he could afford. In 2006, Daniel and Elena were 27 years old with a combined income of $68,000. He taught high school history. She was 3 years into nursing, still picking up the shifts nobody wanted. They had a little saved, enough for a down payment on something modest. And modest was the word the loan officer kept using. The house on Delmore Street was 1,500 square feet. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a laminate kitchen the previous owners were apologetic about. It sat in a neighborhood that was fine. Not up and coming, not falling apart, just fine. Teachers lived there, and nurses, and a mechanic 2 doors down who fixed their car for the cost of parts. Their friends were buying bigger. That was the part that stung. Same jobs, same paychecks, and yet the couples they'd gone to college with were closing on 4-bedroom houses in the newer developments, the ones with the stone facades and the 2-story foyers. Daniel remembers standing in one of those foyers at a housewarming, holding a drink, doing the math he couldn't turn off. The mortgage those friends were carrying was nearly double his. When he asked, gently, how they swung it, the answer was always some version of the same thing. You stretch. Everyone stretches. You grow into it. Elena wanted to grow into it too. Not loudly, not in a way she'd ever admit at the time, but he could see it when her sister Carmen came by. Carmen and her husband had just bought their first place, bigger than Daniel's, and Carmen walked the rooms of the Delmore house with a kind of careful politeness that was worse than anything she could have said out loud, so they put 20% down. $30,400, almost everything they had. They financed $121,600 at a fixed rate of 6 1/8 for 30 years. The payment, once you folded in taxes and insurance, came to a little under $1,000 a month. It felt enormous. It felt like the ceiling of what they could survive. What Daniel didn't know yet was that he'd just done the single most important thing you can do with money, and it didn't feel like brilliance. It felt like settling. Here is the part nobody explains when you're 27 and embarrassed by your kitchen. That payment he locked in, the $739 of principal and interest, was frozen. Not for a year, not for 5, for 3 decades. In 2006, it felt like almost everything they earned. But the number never moved, and everything around it did. Rent in their part of Columbus was around $650 a month for something comparable when they bought. Daniel remembers it because they'd rented before, and the number had felt safe. By 2016, that same rent was pushing $1,100. By the time the realtor called, places smaller than his were listing at $1,600, $1,700 a month, and the young couples signing those leases were doing exactly what he and Elena had done at their age, stretching, telling themselves they'd grow into it. But rent grows with you. That's the trap inside it. Every raise you earn, the market quietly reaches over and takes its cut, because the price of keeping a roof over your head resets every single year to whatever the world decides it's worth. Daniel's roof never reset. His mortgage sat there like a stone in a river while the current rose around it. And the gap between what he paid and what everyone else paid, that gap didn't disappear. It went somewhere. That's the mechanism. It isn't dramatic. There's no windfall, no lucky break, no moment the account balance jumps. It's just a fixed number sitting still inside a world that won't stop climbing, and the difference collecting quietly in the space between the two, year after year, so slowly you could live inside it and never notice. For a long time, Daniel didn't notice either. The proof came later, and it came from someone else's kitchen table. In 2015, a friend from the history department, call him Rob, bought a new house. Bigger, newer, in one of those developments Daniel used to feel small, standing inside. Rob was proud of it, and he had every reason to be. Same salary as Daniel, more or less, same years in. And one night, over the kind of beer where people get honest, Rob told him the number. His payment was just over $2,000 a month. Higher rate than Daniel's, bigger loan, newer everything. Daniel didn't say anything. He just did the arithmetic on the drive home, the way he always did. He was paying about $1,100 a month by then, taxes and insurance included. Rob was paying $2,000. That was $900 a month, every month, that stayed in Daniel's life instead of leaving it. Not because he was smarter, not because he worked harder, because he'd never moved, and the not moving kept handing him back money that other people were handing to a bank. $900 a month. He'd never thought of it as a number before. But sitting at a red light on Livingston Avenue, he multiplied it out, and something shifted in his chest. Over a year, that was nearly $11,000. And he realized, almost with a chill, that he'd been quietly putting most of that difference into a retirement account for years without ever framing it as a choice. It had just been there. The money Rob didn't have, the money the market never got to reprice. He got home that night and looked at the account balance for the first time in months. It was bigger than he expected, not rich, not a headline, but bigger than a high school history teacher had any business having, and every dollar of it traced back to a decision that had felt, at the time, like giving up. He should have felt vindicated. Instead, he felt something more complicated, because he knew Elena still looked at Carmen's house a certain way, and he knew his own income wasn't going to stay flat forever. He was good at his job. People had started to notice, and he understood, even then, that the real test wasn't going to be whether staying still worked when you were broke. It was going to be whether he could keep staying still once the world finally offered him a reason to leave. The offer letter came in the spring of 2021, and for a few days it changed the air in the house. Principal. A full building of his own, over in the Cincinnati area, $15,000 more a year than he was making as an assistant principal in Columbus. Daniel had worked 15 years for a phone call like that. Elena cried a little when he told her, the good kind, and that night at dinner the kids could feel that something had tilted. Mia asked if they were going to be rich. Leo asked if he'd get his own bathroom. Elena was already somewhere ahead of all of them. She was picturing the house they'd buy near the new job. Something newer, something with the kitchen she'd stopped mentioning years ago because mentioning it felt like complaining. For the first time in a long time, she let herself want it out loud. And Daniel, because 20 years in one house had made him this way, opened a spreadsheet. He didn't want to. Part of him was furious at himself for reaching for the laptop instead of the champagne. But he couldn't turn it off. He typed in what a comparable house near the new job would cost in 2021. More than his old neighborhood. A lot more. He typed in the interest rate they'd get on a new mortgage because his old 6 1/8 loan didn't move with him. You don't take your rate with you. You take your equity, minus the cost of selling, and you start over at whatever the world charges today. He added the realtor's commission on the sale of Delmore Street. He added closing costs on the new place. He added the property taxes on a more expensive house, the higher insurance, the furniture Elena would rightly want for rooms they didn't have yet. Then he looked at the monthly number at the bottom, the all-in cost of the new life, and he sat very still. The raise was $15,000 a year before taxes. Call it $900 a month in his pocket after everything came out. The new house, once you added up the reset mortgage, the higher rate, the taxes, the insurance, it cost more than $900 a month above what he was living on now. The promotion paid him more and left him with less. Every month, he'd be a little further behind than the man who'd never gotten the call at all. He showed Elena the screen. He didn't argue. He just let the number sit there between them on the kitchen table, glowing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said the thing he'd never forget. So we worked 20 years to earn the raise, and the raise is the thing that would take it all back. Not exactly. He tried to explain that it wasn't the raise. It was the reset. The fact that moving meant handing back 2 decades of a frozen payment and buying into today's prices at today's rates. The house was the engine. Leaving it meant turning the engine off and paying full price to start a new one, cold. He turned down the job. That should be the triumphant part. It wasn't. It was the hardest thing he'd done, and the cost of it didn't show up on any spreadsheet, because Carmen had moved again. Elena's sister was on her 3rd house by then, each one bigger than the last, and in 2021 she and her husband were touring a place that made everything the Ruizes owned look like a starter. Carmen posted the kitchen. Quartz, farmhouse sink, light pouring in from windows that cost more than Daniel's car, and Elena stared at that photo a beat too long, and Daniel watched her do it, and neither of them said anything. The thing about staying still is that nobody applauds it. Carmen's moves were visible. You could stand in them, photograph them, walk a guest through them. Daniel's decision was invisible by design. It looked, from the outside, exactly like a lack of ambition. Like a man who'd peaked in a 1,500 square foot house and made his family live inside his fear. There were nights Elena wondered out loud whether they'd done the right thing, whether the kids felt it, coming home to the same laminate counters while their cousins had a game room. Whether responsible was just a nicer word for scared. Daniel didn't always have an answer. He believed the math, but you can't hug a math. He'd chosen a kind of wealth that his own wife couldn't always see, and some evenings that loneliness sat between them heavier than any mortgage ever had. He held the line anyway, not because he was certain, because he'd run the numbers so many times he could no longer unknow them. Then the winter of 2024 came, and the house did what old houses do. It broke. The furnace went first, in January, in the kind of cold that makes a broken furnace an emergency instead of an inconvenience. Then the roofer they called to check a leak stood in the attic and gave them the look. The whole roof. Both, more or less at once, $14,000, and no version of the winter where either could wait. Daniel paid it out of the emergency fund, wrote the checks, watched $22,000 of savings drop to $8,000, and never once considered borrowing, because there was nothing to borrow against and no reason to. No mortgage, no car loan, no balance anywhere with his name on it. The house that had never changed had also, somewhere in the quiet, stopped costing him anything but taxes and upkeep, and that meant when $14,000 walked out the door, it was the only thing that left. Nothing else in their life so much as wobbled. He found out later that Carmen's house needed work that same winter. Something with the vac in the big new place, a few $1,000s, and Carmen, 3 houses in, quartz counters and all, had to put it on a card, because the payment on $400,000 at 7+% doesn't leave much behind at the end of the month, no matter how good the kitchen looks in the photo. She had the house that got applause. Daniel had the house that could take a hit. He didn't feel triumphant about that either. He felt something closer to sad, watching 2 sisters who'd started in almost the same place end up with such different kinds of safety. One of them owned a beautiful house. The other one owned the ground under her feet, which is the thing nobody tells you about being rich. It was never about the house being impressive. It was about the house being paid for and standing still long enough that time could do the one thing time does better than any raise ever will. The realtor's number is still on his phone when he walks back down the hall. $345,000. He doesn't feel the urge to sell. He knows what that number really is. Not cash, not a prize, just the visible shadow of 20 years of a payment that never moved while the world moved around it. If he sold, he'd only have to buy back into that same rising world at today's price. The house isn't valuable because he could leave it. It's valuable because he never did. He stops at the doorframe. The old marks are there. Mia at 4'1", Leo at 3'9", the ones he can't date anymore. And there's a newer one now, higher than all of them. Leo, 16, 5'10", measured last month, already complaining he's taller than his dad. The wood is the same wood. The house is the same house. The people who grew up against this doorframe are almost gone now, off to lives of their own, and the only thing that held perfectly still through all of it was the address. Daniel puts his thumb on the newest mark. He thinks about the phone call, and the spreadsheet, and the job he didn't take, and the winter the roof came down and nothing else did. The house never changed. Everything around it did. And he's starting to think that was never the sacrifice. It was the whole point. If your own front door has a story like this one, staying or leaving, I'd like to hear it in the comments. And if you want to see what happens to the people who did the opposite, who moved every time the paycheck grew, that's the next one.